hale, Wēsaþ hale und bēoþ wilcuman. Welcome to part 1 of this episode about the Anglo-Saxon rune when. Now, before we begin, I would just like to say thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you for watching, and a big thank you to all of my subscribers. I really appreciate your support. If you're not already subscribing, please subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and it's really great to hear your comments. If you want to support me further, you can buy me a coffee, which is much appreciated, and I'm also on Patreon. So my aim, I'm on a mission basically, a mission to prove that the heathen Anglo-Saxons were every bit as amazing and cool as the Vikings, who, let's face it, are getting all of the press at the moment. But the Anglo-Saxons, their culture is so rich and incredibly interesting, and I'm on a mission to bring that to you. So really appreciate your subscription. Thank you. So we're talking about the rune when today. Now, anyone who knows anything about runes will probably recognise this rune as an extremely positive rune. It is indeed the rune of joy. Now, when I first read this poem and started to think about what I could possibly say in this episode, I have to admit I couldn't really think of much to say. I mean, what can you really say about joy? Well, I did wonder whether I should just talk about Anglo-Saxons doing happy things for half an hour, spending time with family, hanging out down the mead hall, having a dance, or even hugging dogs. But actually, when I started thinking about this in more depth, I realised that there's actually a lot that can be said about the concept of joy for the Anglo-Saxons. So I'm actually going to have quite a few parts to this episode, and I'm not just going to be talking about joy, I'm going to be talking about the flip side, because there's always a flip side in life. So that will be in later parts of this episode. So we actually have loads to get through, so let's get going. So we'll start, as I always like to, by hearing the Anglo-Saxon rune poem for this one. When na Blueseth, they can wen a leet, Salas and Soya and himsilfa half, Blood and Blissa and Eik Berger ye nicked. So that was it in Old English, obviously. I'm going to read you the Stephen Pollington translation of this into modern English, because for me that's the translation which I prefer. Happiness he cannot enjoy, who knows little woe, pain and sorrow, and has for himself wealth and joy and sufficient protection too. So this rune was adopted into the bookhand as this symbol. And shall we look at the shape of the rune? The sound it gives us is a W, a W, a W. And here's the rune. There you are. Can you see that? Very similar to the thorn, but you can see the triangle has moved up the pole to the top, almost like a flag. There you go. That's the shape of the rune. And what I'd like to do now is, before we move on, let's look at some of the words that we actually get within this rune poem, because it's quite interesting, and as I'm sure I've mentioned before, there's quite often multiple meanings for words in Old English. So the word when, as we've said, it basically translates as hope, expectation, joy. Now sometimes it's written as win, so you might see it in either form, the when or the win. Now that word can be translated as delight or pleasure. Now we can find lots of words in the Old English language which contain this word win. We could have winbeam, which is a tree which causes delight. Now that's actually an epithet for the cross in a Christian context, but you know, I like to think of it as a really nice tree, because I'm sure we've all met really nice trees which have brought us joy. We've got Winber, which is a town where life is pleasant. So if you live in a town where you feel your life is pleasant, you can call that a Winber. We've got Windleam, a joyful sound, and Winland, which is of course a land of delight, a happy, pleasant land. Certainly not this land at the moment, but there you go. We've got Winlust, which is sensual pleasure, and we'll be talking about that more in a later part of this episode. We've also got Winwort, which is a joyful plant, a pleasant plant. And actually an Anglo-Saxon epithet for the sun is win candle, which is quite interesting. I'm lucky because it is a very pleasant day today. I think this is probably the last day this year I'm going to be able to get my skin out. It is a little bit nippy, but not too bad. But yeah, the old win candle is certainly shining today. What else have we got? Now there's an adjective, winleach, which means delightful, pleasant, charming. Now let's move on and look at a verb which is in this rune poem. It's a strong verb, and it is the verb wilcuman. Now, as I've said, lots of Anglo-Saxon words have multiple meanings, and the verb wilcuman can be interpreted in a number of different ways. To use, make use of, to pass, spend, enjoy, have enjoyment of, to eat, bear, or discharge. Now this is actually a verb which can have sexual connotations, and as I've said, we will come to that later. So other key words within this poem are sa, which means pain, suffering, soreness. Sore, very similar, isn't it? And soir, care, anxiety. Now blad is a very interesting word, and as I said, true Anglo-Saxon style, this one does have multiple meanings again. Now in this context, in the context of this poem, it means enjoyment, prosperity, abundance, success, blessedness, gift and reward, benefit, glory and honour. So lots of really positive associations there. But other meanings it has is a leaf or blade, surrounded by them at the moment, a cup, a blast of wind, or a fruit. Now we can find several words in the Old English language which are formed from this word. For example, we can have a Blad day, a prosperous, happy day. We can have a Bēoþ, a giver of prosperity, happiness and glory. And we can have Bladwella, fruitful riches. Okay, let's move on to bliss. Now, as you've probably guessed, this word does actually mean bliss. Bliss, joy, exaltation and pleasure. So this word is related to the verb blissian, which means to rejoice, to make glad. And quite often in Anglo-Saxon literature it's used in a religious sense. But interestingly, it can also denote friendship. Now lastly, we have the words bēoþ and unikt. Now bēoþ basically means dwelling or a settlement, as in Bur. However, it can also, surprise, surprise, it has two meanings. It can also mean a pledge, a creditor, one who has made a pledge. And unikt means abundance, fullness, sufficiency. So when I read this poem, the thing that kind of struck me, and this comes through more in Stephen Pollington's translation, is to me what it's saying is it's difficult to really appreciate and appreciate that joy unless you have known pain and sorrow and suffering. Other people may interpret it differently, but when you look at the poem in that way, it makes a lot of sense to me. I believe that if you have gone through dark times, difficult times, troubled times, then when you do have moments of joy, that you appreciate and you feel that joy on a much deeper and more intense level. If you've only ever known happiness and you've never known, really difficult times in your life, then maybe you cannot experience that joy on the same deep level as you can if you have seen the other side of the coin. So to me, that is how I like to view this particular poem. So we will, as I said, we will be looking in later parts of this episode at what brought the Anglo-Saxons sorrow and pain and how they coped with it or didn't. But for now, we're going to start with the happy side of the coin now. This episode is all about joy. So I always think that one of the best ways to work out what really does make you happy is to rule out what doesn't. And we can pretty much do the same with the Anglo-Saxons, because the Anglo-Saxons didn't tend to write really happy, joyous poems. They tended to write a lot of elegies where they were lamenting the joys that they had lost, that they formerly enjoyed. And I've mentioned the Anglo-Saxon elegies before in a previous episode, so I'll put a link to that. So let's have a look at one of those elegies, shall we? Which is The Wanderer, a wonderful poem. And I shall read you a section from that. I just want to say I have once again traipsed out to somewhere really remote and beautiful, just at the top of a lovely little waterfall. And wherever you go, you cannot escape those ruddy aeroplanes, can you? Honestly. Anyway, sorry, I'll stop ranting now. Let's go back to the Wanderer. Okay. He deeply pondered this dark life, keen mind, recalled many conflicts from far off times, and then spoke these words: "Where is the horse gone? Where the rider? Where the giver of rings? Where has gone the merriment of the mead hall? Alas for our loss! Alas for the finely carved drinking horn! Alas for the hale warrior well armoured! Alas for the prince's splendid procession! Ah, how that age has passed away, and now all is dark under the helm of night, as though it never were." So you may recognise those words as having greatly influenced Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings. Now this poem, The Wanderer, has obviously been written from the perspective of one of the warrior elites. And I've spoken extensively before about the warrior culture within Anglo-Saxon society and the heroic ideal. And it seems to have left a strong impression from that age on the artefacts and the writings that we have left to us. Bēoþ being the classic example of this. But what about simpler folks? What about more everyday, ordinary people rather than these brave warriors? Now we obviously know that due to the way that the world was in those days, the Anglo-Saxons placed a great deal of emphasis and importance upon family and community. They had to. They didn't have the luxury to go it alone. It simply wasn't possible in those days. Whereas we can now, back in those days it was virtually impossible. You needed the support of your family, of your community. Now the family structure does seem to be a lot less important to people now than it obviously was even a generation ago, I would say, many people now live alone and don't have the support of a family unit. But as I said, the Anglo-Saxons needed this. And to be honest, when I think back to what a close-knit connection I had with my family when I was a child, you know, saw both sets of my grandparents every weekend. It was wonderful, really. It was wonderful. I'm sad that my daughter hasn't had that, but all of my family, we all lived in the same area, over a couple of villages, and at Christmas time we'd have all of the family gathering, that kind of thing. But, well, it may in your family, but it's kind of passed away in mine as times have moved on. But I think maybe society is a lot poorer for not having that anymore. I speak from my own personal experience, but it was certainly very happy times for me as a child, having that very close-knit connection with my family. Now, the Anglo-Saxons, they had several words for family, which shows what an important concept it was for them, and the most usual being kin. Now, the modern phrase kith and kin is obviously derived from the Old English kith and kin, meaning friends and family. Now, the structure of the nuclear family in Anglo-Saxon times is pretty much how it still is and how we would expect it to be. The father was considered to be the head of the family. His role was obviously to protect his family, to keep them safe, to make sure that they were provided with safety and protection and food. And the male side of the family, the paternal side of the family, was called the spear half, obviously after a weapon. Now, the maternal side of the family was known as the spinelhialf and was represented by the spindle. Now, the mother's role was to create harmony in the family, peace weavers, to weave harmony into family relationships. And of course, we hear about the great peace weavers from the tales. For example, Wēsaþ from the Beowulf story. But of course, she was a high-class woman, but women from all different ranks would have been expected to perform this role. Now, the woman, around her waist, she would most probably have worn a girdle hanger, which was a representation of the keys, and basically show her position as a keeper and guardian of the home. Now, these symbols of femininity were often found as grave goods, which is why we know about them. But not always, and we'll talk about that in a later episode. Now, the words that we have for members of the family, very, very similar to modern English, so you probably won't have too much trouble grasping them. Fada for father, modo for mother, brother for brother, and suesta for sister. Now, grandparents were known, as you might expect, as eldvader and eldmodo, old father, old mother. A daughter was a dotter, a son was a sunu. Now, a wife could be known as a weef, a quain or a weef man, and a husband was known as a churl or ware. Now, there was actually a very close and special relationship in Anglo-Saxon society between a mother's brother and the children, so the children and their maternal uncle. Now, that uncle would most likely spend a lot of time with those children, probably spoiling them rotten, as uncles like to do, teaching them skills, helping them learn the skills that they would need for adulthood. And, I did actually, sometimes, you can have such a wonderful connection with your uncle, can't you? And I know that when I was a kid, my mum's brother, actually my only uncle by blood, he was brilliant. I mean, I really loved Uncle Stephen when I was a kid. He was such good fun. We used to have amazing times. He was so silly, and of course us kids loved that. He probably got a bit fed up with us, but never mind. But yeah, that really wonderful connection between children and their uncle. Now Tacitus actually mentions this when he talks about the Germanic tribes on the continent. So we're going back to AD 98 here, and he says the sons of sisters are as highly honoured by their uncles as by their own fathers. Some tribes even consider the former tie the closer and more sacred of the two, and in demanding hostages prefer nephews to sons, thinking that this gives them a firmer grip on men's hearts and a wider hold on the family. So that's really interesting. It seems that this connection between children and their maternal uncle was considered maybe more prized than the connection with the father, which is quite bizarre, but yeah. Now the uncle was known as an eam. A nephew, who was the son of a sister, this gets confusing, was a suesta sunul, which makes perfect sense, and a nephew in general was called a nefa or a yenefa. And sutta, there's actually a word, sutta faderlan, and that's a word for an uncle and a nephew, and that does actually crop up in the next part of this episode where I'm reading from Beowulf. So just to be fair, we've spoken a lot about uncles. Aunties are wonderful too. I've got some great aunties. So an aunt was a modlija probably. A paternal auntie, a father's sister, was a fabul. And a niece was known as a nefenna or a nift. I like nift. And I would just like to say a big thank you to my nift for all the help that she has given me with these videos. She has been a little superstar. Bless her heart. My nift is Swiefer Wunderlich. There you go. Now a friend was known as a friond or a wiener. Now, of course, we all want our families to be protected, and we want them to be safe. You know, nothing could be more important than knowing your family are safe. And this, of course, would have been of extreme concern to the Anglo-Saxons in such a turbulent society, with all of the rivalries between different tribes and, everything that was going on. Turbulent times, where they were constantly jostling for land and power. To know that your family were protected would of course been extremely important, and of course this rune poem speaks of sufficient protection too. In that kind of turbulent world, that would have been of key importance. Here comes another plane. I'm just going to wait for it to go. Right, that was actually a helicopter, noisy old thing. It's gone now. So of course in this subsistence society, scarcity would have been a really high probability. So knowing that you had enough food for yourself and your family would have been so important, and obviously a prerequisite to joy. It's very, very difficult to be happy when you've got an empty, rumbling tummy and you don't know when your next meal will be on the table. Unfortunately, we have a lot of that going on in this country at the moment. So being able to provide for your family, being able to grow enough food, and of course in those kind of communities everybody would have had a role. They would have worked together. The energy of this rune is it's the kind of joy that you get when you've earned it. It's not just what you're given on a plate. This is about earning that joy, earning all of those things that bring joy to you. I think there's another one coming now, so it's really getting on my wick now. We'll carry on. I hope it's not too noisy. And of course, I'm just going to wait. Right, so in an agricultural society, everybody would have had to have worked towards that aim of bringing in the harvest. Now, of course, I'm farmer's daughter, so although things have moved on incredibly, I have an idea of this concept from personal experience. Sometimes things don't go as planned. Sometimes the weather is all wrong. Sometimes you get rain when you need sun. Sometimes you get sun when you need rain. It happens a lot these days. And so the threat of a failed harvest would have been incredibly terrifying for the Anglo-Saxons. So I believe that it would have been quite normal for the Anglo-Saxons to make offerings to their gods, to the spirits of the land, to ensure that they had a good harvest. Now there's no denying that they would have had very strong connections with the local spirits, with the whites, with the land and of the water. And I'm sure in times of plenty, when they had a good harvest, they would have thanked the gods for that harvest, because the harvest was all important. And I'm sure that when things were bad, they would have made offerings, sacrifices to the gods to help them through those tough times. So let's have a little look, shall we? Bēoþ ye godol. Thankieth for and blessung. Father, Thunor, Flia. Ye opianath hiaten to Thara bletsunger blood und aber bēoþ us. Father, Woden. Das Jifa on Thinum Nama. So I'd just like to say, in case anyone was worried, that was fake blood. I wouldn't go doing any real sacrifices, but it did kind of make me chuckle, in case any unsuspecting dog walkers wandered down to the river and found all that blood all over the tree. They might have had a bit of a shock. Anyway, I think I've said enough about this for now. In part 2, we're going to be in the mead hall talking about hall joy, so do join me for that next part of the episode. So I'd just like to say thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate your support. Please like and subscribe. As I said, I have a Patreon, which I appreciate support with. Thank you so much to my existing patrons. That really is very much appreciated. So yes, thank you. And all that remains to be said is farewell and bēoþ hale. Ayla.